Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back. I know some of you are still eating your lunch. Perfectly fine. But thank you for joining us as we continue this day here at the Sheraton Centre. And I want to introduce right now Owen Ripley. Now, he is the Associate Assistant Deputy Minister at Heritage Canada. And basically this next session will be focusing on what was called C-18, the Online News Act, which passed earlier this year. Now, it goes into effect in about a couple months' time. The regulations around it still being worked through, but will have and has had a pretty big impact on what we do as journalists right across the country, which is why we have invited Owen today to be a part of our discussion. So a round of applause for Owen Ripley, who has kindly donated his time. Now, a bit of an idea of the format. I'll begin the discussion. I have some questions I'll be asking of Owen regarding the Online News Act. But we also have people walking around the room, 3 with microphones, I believe. I don't know if they can identify themselves right now. But through the course of this discussion, we really encourage this to be a Q&A. Owen, right before he walked up here, was comparing it to a little bit like a parliamentary committee appearance. We're not that tough. We're nicer.
Remains to be seen.
Okay. But we do encourage this very much to be a question and answer period. So if you have questions about C-18, if you're looking for some clarity, if you're looking to just gain further understanding, please raise your hand. And one of the moderators who are on the floor, again, there will be 3 with a microphone, will be able to bring the microphone to you, and you can ask your question of Owen. So thank you again for being here.
You're welcome.
So let's just begin, I guess, more broadly, because there's been so much discussion about C-18 up until this point. Let's begin with almost a common understanding. What was the intent of the bill? Who was it actually meant to benefit when it was being put together?
Yeah. It was meant to benefit news organizations and ultimately Canadians by providing access to revenue streams so that those news organizations could continue to invest in having reporters and a journalism footprint in our communities.
So that was the intent, and it comes out of a need because we were seeing a shift in terms of the revenue streams.
Yeah, it comes out of a need of, and I'm not telling anything that no one in this room doesn't know. I mean, it comes out of a need of, we have seen tremendous disruption and change in the news sector over the last 10 to 20 years. I was looking at the stats in advance of today's discussion, and 10-year period, number of journalists falling from 35,000, almost half of that, just shy of half of that. Hundreds of closures. There have been also a couple of hundred new news outlets who's opened in that same period. But there's no doubt that the journalism footprint has shrunk tremendously, and for the government, that's a concern, right? Because at the end of the day, our democracy lies on folks like you and the folks in this room holding our institutions, holding our officials to account. And I think, increasingly we know that there are, there was times where you have provincial legislatures without kind of full-time coverage, let alone city halls and at the municipal level.
Mm-hmm. So when you look at or consider the initial idea and the hope around this bill, now that it has received royal assent, not yet completely implemented, but now that it's received royal assent, what would you say about the Act as it exists right now? Do you think it's going to meet the original intent?
That certainly remains the objective and the hope of the government, is that the regulatory process concludes in a way where you have Google who ultimately chooses to participate in the framework, as set out, and agrees to come to the bargaining table with news businesses and their collectives, and respects the spirit of the act and the legislation that was passed by Parliament.
Well, let's build on that, because as we said, the Act received royal assent in June, so earlier this year. And once receiving royal assent, Meta, which we already were getting an idea of it, they made the decision by August to withdraw all news content from their platforms, Facebook included. As you say, Google is still in negotiation. They're still a part of this process as you try to finalize the regulations around this act. How would you describe those discussions right now? Are they positive? Because we're still only, not still, we're just 2 months away when we're supposed to be implementing the regulations.
So I would characterize the discussion. So there's open channels with Google, and I would characterize them as constructive. For folks who've had an opportunity to, read their blog, read the media coverage around it, that they participated in the regulatory process and gave the government feedback on those regulations, and so we have a good idea of what their main concerns are, and the road ahead is analyzing their submission as well as the other submissions that we got, and assessing how the regulations need to be modified.
Okay, I'm going to build a little bit on that, because among the concerns that we've heard from Google, they say that the law is based on a flawed premise, arguing that they are not profiting unfairly from the sharing of news. They say criteria for eligible businesses are too vague, that the exemption provisions are too vague, and that there should be a firm ceiling on what they have to pay out instead of a firm floor. When you hear those concerns from Google, do you think all of those might be addressed before December 19?
I think the objective as we finalize the regulations is to, in good faith, look at where Google is coming from with some of those concerns, seek to respond to them, address them as best we can without undermining the core objective of the legislation as adopted by Parliament, which, as it exists, is to put in place a bargaining framework where the expectation is for these large dominant platforms that they engage in good faith negotiations with news businesses whose content is being made available on those platforms, and seek to sign agreements with them based on the way I characterize kind of the exemption criteria set out in the Act is a public interest frame, right? And that's what we're seeking to do, is make sure that those agreements benefit a wide diversity of news outlets across the country, in the different language markets, at national, regional, local level, and in various communities.
Mm-hmm. Let's step back a bit, because I think it's also worthwhile. You talk about not just dollar figures, but actions in kind. But really, it's also about encouraging platforms that get to the size of a Google to negotiate. It's not necessarily to move in right away, but you're encouraging negotiation. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, the driver, and I think this is sometimes lost in the public debate around C18, but the main driver is a competition driver, right? And you and I were chatting earlier. The challenge is these big platforms basically have become a main gateway for us all to access all sorts of content, but also news and information content. And for your average news business now, whose business model may still rely heavily on the advertising market, for your average news business, they are both now reliant on these platforms to reach their audience. They're dependent on them from a distribution perspective. And at the same time, they are competing with those same platforms in the advertising market. And so the relationship between your news business and that platform isn't a fair one, because the news business is at a serious disadvantage, because the partner across the table is both their competitor in one respect and their distributor in another respect, or at least part of the way that they distribute their content.
Mm-hmm. Without a doubt, high stakes when it comes to the future of journalism, the future of different media organizations. But we mentioned the fact that Meta immediately withdrew news content from their sites, and there has been a practical impact on that, because as Meta was coming up, in particular Facebook was coming up, it became a place for many Canadians to discover the new media rather than the established media, new media companies that were able to draw eyeballs through that platform and therefore onto their product. But once Meta stepped back, they lost that. So that has had an immediate impact on their business. That has had an immediate impact on the type of journalism they can do, the type of employees that they can actually employ. What are the discussions happening right now at the federal level and the Ottawa level about the impact if Google follows Meta's path?
Yeah, so I would reiterate, the government remains hopeful that the conversations that we're having with Google as we work through their submission, that we are not in a position where Google chooses to remove news from its services. I don't believe that's something that Google wants to do. I don't believe that's something that the news businesses whose content can be found on Google wants to happen, and it's not something the government wants to happen. And so, when I look at that triangle, that all the vested interests, want to find a way forward, and that is, what we're focused on doing. And I would say, Google, made the bargaining framework work in Australia. I acknowledge there are differences between the Australian framework and the Canadian framework, no doubt, and that those are material differences, and that Google has issue with some of those differences. But I think the principle stands that they have made a bargaining framework work in another jurisdiction, and that's the hope here.
Mm-hmm. The hope here, and I'm sorry, I'm going to circle back a little bit, because as we heard, one of the concerns is the dollar figure. Obviously, it's a private company. They want to turn a profit, and they're concerned about a floor being set but not a ceiling being set. Is that a big part of the discussion right now?
So the regulations as they stand, I use the word threshold intentionally, because depending on who you ask, it was either a ceiling or a floor. It was, from the government's perspective, it was a threshold. And it was a threshold because, the dollar figure, which is related to one of the criteria in the Act, which is actually about making a contribution to the sustainability of the news sector, is one of several criteria, right? And so the way that it was structured was to say, and as you likely know, we proposed a formula, but we believe for Google that formula would work out to be about $172 million. And I call it a threshold because, the minimum or maximum that you have to spend is 172, as long as you meet the other criteria in the Act, right? So I'm not disputing that there's work to do on a platform's part to make that work and make the puzzle come together, but diversity of agreements across the country, responding to those criteria in the Act, and the idea was, or an expectation that Google invest $172 million.
I'm going to quickly pause, and I will remind people that this is open to your questions as well. If you have any questions about the Online News Act that you want to ask of Owen, by all means raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you and you can be a part of the discussion. We have a question up here in the front.
Thank you very much. You were just asked a question a second ago about if there is a plan in place if Google does back out. I feel like I heard you say you're hopeful they won't, but do you actually have a plan, and what is that plan?
Yeah, and right now the plan is, the Online News Act is a piece of legislation that was passed by Parliament, and I think in a democracy, Parliament has spoken, and they have made it clear that the expectation in Canada is that these platforms contribute in an important way. And my job these days is not to second guess what Parliament has passed. My job these days is working within that framework and working with Google to find a way forward with them that works for them and that respects the spirit of the legislation that was passed by Parliament.
Sorry, can we get the microphone back here, please?
Let's assume that they do back out, though. What do you do?
Yeah, I don't think it's black and white, right? Like I think Google has been very constructive in its discussions with the government and is being clear, that they are prepared to contribute to supporting the sustainability of news in Canada, that they would like to find a way forward. They have given us constructive feedback on the regulations that they exist, but they've also been clear, like I'm not hiding anything, they've also been clear that they're not sure that all their concerns can be addressed within regulations, right? Right now, from the government perspective, we're focusing on doing our best to address their concerns through regulations, right? And at the end of the day, we will see how that process ends. And Google has been clear that what they believe may be some of the issues that can't be addressed. But we're not at a point yet where I'm prepared to say to you that all their concerns can't be addressed through the regulatory process.
Oh, another question? Yes.
Hello. Speaking to a room of journalists, what is your message to a number of people here who have had colleagues laid off in the last few months solely based on the fact that Meta has pulled out of the news landscape, and knowing that if Google pulls out, that situation is going to go from bad to worse?
Yeah. Look, I know, and that what's transpiring right now in Canada is having real impacts on the ground. Like there is no denying that. Again, we're in a period where we're working through the implementation of this legislation, and my hope is that ends with Google participating and investing those, the amount of money that we've discussed, and that will flow through to news organizations on the ground. Meta has been clear that they are ending news availability in Canada while this legislation is in place. I think sometimes when it comes to Meta, what we don't talk about as much is that my read is Meta's making a more global policy decision on this issue. So internationally, you have seen them end their programs to support news in the United States. They've announced their end in France, in Germany. You are seeing them reduce the availability of news in other jurisdictions. There's been reporting on that in the United States. And so what is happening vis-a-vis Meta is not unique to Canada. Meta is making a policy decision internationally that news that they are not going to support news organizations, and right now they've been clear with the Canadian government that if there is a framework in place that obliges them to do that, then they're going to end the availability of news to not be subject to that framework.
I know I have a question. Just give me 1 second, because I think it's worthwhile to also note we were talking behind the scenes, and the truth of the matter is Meta's engagement level has not dropped by their decision to withdraw from news totally. Is that correct?
That's what Meta has said. Yes, so they have said that they have not seen an engagement drop. They've not seen a revenue drop since ending the availability of news. Obviously from the government perspective, it's the wrong decision to make. They are, from the government's perspective, shirking a responsibility that comes with the position that they occupy in the digital marketplace. The irony a little bit, we talked about how, C18 is really a competition intervention in some respects, in light of the fact that these platforms occupy such a dominant position on the distribution channel, and the fact the ending of news availability proves that point, right? And it is designed to basically show that they have the ability to cut off that distribution channel if, in the case of what we're talking about, the Parliament of Canada passes a piece of legislation that they disagree with.
Mm-hmm. Okay, a question in the back of the room.
Thank you. Yeah, you actually answered my first question, which was Facebook in this ever? Was this just a bit of a convenient excuse to walk away as part of a bigger play? I guess my next question would be about the organizations that have filed a request for a review by the Competition Bureau on this. Any thoughts on the likelihood of that as a strategy?
Yeah, so just on your first question, I mean, people may have different opinions on that first question about, was Facebook ever in it? I would say, I've been around these issues now for a bit. When I first started, interacting with Meta and Facebook on issues around news, being on their platform, at the time, my recollection is, they would tell me that, news was about 6% of news feed. Prior to the Online News Act coming into force, I think they were telling us it was down to 3%, right? So, like, what I see is over that period, you see them reducing the prominence of news on newsfeed, and I don't like what they will tell us is that it's because it's not content that drives engagement on their platform, right? And so I think folks can come to different opinions about that. On your second question, so yes, there is a complaint before the Competition Bureau. I'm not a Competition Bureau expert, so I won't weigh in on kind of the success or not of those arguments that have been put forward. But I would reiterate, I mean, C18 is intended to be a competition intervention, right? I think obviously there's a bigger conversation taking place globally right now about these platforms and competition policy more broadly than just specifically related to news.
Mm-hmm. Yes, another question.
I'm just wondering what your response is to the fact government policy here created a level playing field that never existed in reality in the first place. Not everyone is the size of Global or CTV or CBC, nor has the revenue. The smaller players across the country may have had real benefit from Facebook taking their news for free and had no problem with it. Maybe it drove revenue to their websites by the clicks, whatever it was. You've created a level playing field that doesn't exist in the first place.
So look, I want to acknowledge there are going to be different opinions on whether C18 is a good or bad policy decision. Your question. So a couple things on your question. One is, and again, you may disagree with what I'm about to say, in light of how this has played out. But The government was very mindful that it wanted to create a framework that would flow benefits to smaller news organizations. And that was one of the changes we made based on the Australian model. We didn't want a model that was exclusively to the benefit of kind of the big national chains. And I come back to kind of my public interest frame on kind of what you have to do to get an exemption. And when you look at those, like it's about both the big and the small. I also want to acknowledge, the government has never pretended that that platforms bring no benefits to news organizations. We know that. We know they do. We know that they are very important from a distribution perspective. And I know that some folks will feel that, that was good enough. From the government's perspective, it wasn't good enough because it left, again, news businesses as a whole entirely dependent on that relationship. I come back to kind of the main driver for government getting involved on this file, and it's because when we look at when we look at the trends, when we look at the stats, it is really worrisome, and the decline in journalists is concerning. And so my hope has always been we get to a time where things stabilize. There's the emergence of more successful business models, we do have that greater stability in the sector. C18 was and is intended, though, to say to platforms it's more than just distribution. In light of that position of dominance that you have, you have to come and be prepared to bargain.
Okay. Can you maybe build upon that? You talked about the exemptions that are meant to help smaller news organizations. What exactly?
So if you look at the, sorry, I have an ice cube. If you look at the list of exemption criteria, you will see that you have to sign agreements with independent local news organizations. You have to sign agreements with news organizations in Indigenous communities. You have to sign agreements with news organizations in official language minority communities. And you have to sign agreements with a diversity of news organizations, again, kind of across the country in the various markets. That was a frame that was completely lacking from the Australian model, right? There were no guideposts in Australia. It was kind of just go out, make some agreements, and the government of Australia
was the first.
Australia was the first with this model, and the government of Australia kind of did a yay or nay, right? The platforms liked that model, but I think what we were concerned about with that model is it left an incredible amount of discretion to one government minister, and here in Canada we wanted to be transparent about how the benefits should flow in the news sector to ensure that they were benefiting a wide variety of folks.
Mm-hmm. As we talk about Meta, do you see, and I understand what you're saying about where you believe Meta's global positioning is, but does that then lead you to conclude that Meta is no longer a player ever, or are there talks with them right now?
We have open communications channels with Meta. They have been transparent with us about once the act got royal assent, they were transparent with us. About the position they were likely to take with that, and they were transparent about kind of the timelines on which they would do. Meta has continued to say that basically while the act is in force, they will end the news availability of news in Canada. Whether they will ever change their position on that is a question for them. On that point, again, sometimes we think this is just a Canada problem. I think we're at a really critical moment globally right now because, You've had Australia that moved. You've had France and Germany that have moved. You know, you've had Canada that moved. You have efforts underway in New Zealand, South Africa, Brazil, you know, United States at the national level, California. And so, you know, the platforms are being confronted with kind of a global policy issue about what do we do, right? But I come back to, you know, again, from the government of Canada's perspective, the right thing to do when democracies are asking you to accept a certain degree of responsibility in light of your position in the marketplace is to step up. But I think there's a much, you know, these companies are global, and there's something much bigger than just Canada at play right now.
And more than just Google, because as much as this was set up with two big companies that would apply to based on the criteria set out in the bill, Meta and Google, but it also creates, as you were saying in the back, an environment for others, most notably Bing right now coming out in their growth. But you know, we're quickly running out of time. But I do want to ask you, we started this by talking about the intent of the bill. This is meant to come into play by December the 19th. The parliamentary calendar is quickly running down. One, do you expect that deadline to be made? What can we expect to see between now and then?
Yeah, so December 19th is the date because the Senate introduced an amendment that was ultimately adopted that basically the entire, so we brought certain provisions of the Act into force right away, including kind of some exemptions from the Competition Act that allow news businesses to collectively organize so that they could bargain and collect as with platforms. But the vast majority of the Act still isn't in force, you know, the Senate thought it important that there be a time limit on when the Act could come into force, and they said 180 days. So the December 19th is because when the Act got royal assent, a 6-month clock started, and it's up on December 19th. We are doing everything possible on the department side, you know, to complete the regulatory process in that time frame. You know, we were very, I mean, I know, you know, folks don't feel government moves very fast, but like we were quick out of the gate with the proposed, you know, regulations in a context where there was a cabinet shuffle and everything. And that shows the government's really serious about, you know, trying to work through these issues in the time that's been given to us. And yeah, the goal over the next couple of months, and it's a tall order, but the goal over the next couple of months is to digest all the feedback that we've got and continue the discussions with Google with a view to finalizing the regulations by December 19th.
And at the end of the day, obviously, you've heard some concerns here. You've heard some pushback here. What do you hope the legacy of this law will be?
Yeah. You know, I think if at the end of the day, Google chooses to participate, we will have established a model that, again, is, you know, the things that I think really stand to Canada's credit in this regard is that, you know, parliamentarians were very intentional about putting a public interest frame around this legislation, which wasn't there in Australia. They were also very intentional about making sure there's a degree of transparency and safeguards in terms of how the money flow. That wasn't there in Australia. And so, you know, I do think those things are good. You know, when we are talking about these kind of models, I think it's really important to have those things in place, and I think, you know, New Zealand's a good example in terms of they have looked to some of those facets of the Canadian legislation as a model to emulate, and so I think, you know, that will be that. I think those things will continue to grow and evolve as you see these kind of frameworks work out internationally. You know, there's a big test coming up for Australia. So Australia was the first mover. You know, one of the key differences between Canada and Australia, so Australia's, you know, and this is the part of Australia that the platforms like, right? In Australia, you have the legislation, but the platforms aren't currently subject to the legislation, because the way it worked in Australia was do enough deals and we won't subject you to the legislation. Those deals are coming up, by all accounts, what we hear, starting next year, and the question will be, how will the platforms respond in Australia? How will the Australian government, which is not, been developments in Australia since then, how are they going to respond to that situation? What we're attempting to do in Canada is establish a framework that, subjects the platforms to the law at all times. And again, that's, I think, part of what's at issue in Canada is they don't want to be subject to that framework on an ongoing basis and have the oversight on an ongoing basis. But I think, if it works, the idea is to establish that framework that, runs and takes care of itself over time. And we've put in place infrastructure and a frame so that it can do so. And we don't have kind of, these every 3 to 5 years, a question of are platforms in or out.
Okay. Owen Ripley, thank you for the time today.
Thanks, Michael.
And thank you.
It's a story impacting every Canadian, coast to coast.
Are you surprised that there's still that anger out there?
Welcome to another miracle on the prairie.
Thanks for joining us here. The story is making news.
It's stunning to me how much gas